nobody in Hollywood more into fantasy football than Andy Holloway, one of the most Hollywood guys we know from the Footballers podcast. It's great to have you on, man.
Hey, Ben, appreciate you having me on. I was all ready to talk fantasy with you. I'm in a good mood, and then you brought up the Milwaukee Bucks beating my Suns again, and I'm a little flustered now.
Yeah, Suns in 4 guy. It's called karma.
Oh.
That's what happened to you, Andy. Let's talk some fantasy football, though, shall we? Who's the number 1 pick in fantasy this year?
It's Christian McCaffrey.
Ooh.
I think we're pretty sure of that this year. Feeling comfortable with him at number 1. I mean, limited season last year, but he's like 2 players in one. So I don't think you're going to regret going him number 1.
We had some questions here in the studio. Perhaps Dalvin Cook in the mix, maybe Derrick Henry. Are there any ideas that make sense to go off of Christian McCaffrey at number 1?
Yeah, I think you can. I mean, Dalvin Cook has been so darn reliable, and he represents that same type of value and multi-threat that Christian McCaffrey does. So if you want to head that direction, it makes sense. Henry's tough because, I mean, you go up over 2,000 yards, but he's getting older, and he does not contribute in the passing game the way that McCaffrey and Cook does, and that's just like cheat code for fantasy football.
Andy Holloway joining the show, host of the Fantasy Footballers podcast. Ben Lyons in for Rich on the Rich Eisen Show. This time of year when you're watching preseason as a fantasy footballer, are you taking anything from these games that you can apply to the season? What are you looking for in the preseason as a fan?
Yeah, that's a good question because the more media coverage we get of all this stuff, the more insane levels of hype and coach speak and extrapolation of what you see on 3 plays happens, and then Twitter gets a buzz. And I even saw, I think, training camp stats, like stat lines from Jimmy Garoppolo versus Trey Lance this past week. So something to tweet about, I guess. I think the best thing to do is just try to not overemphasize one play or another play. But, last night's game, one of the things that was interesting to me was like Antonio Gibson. Everybody loves Antonio Gibson in fantasy football, but he didn't take a 3rd down snap with the first team. J.D. McKissick was still out there. So I think you just try to pay a little bit of attention to some of those subtle things where can I get a gauge on what this offense is looking to do, and try not to overreact. If a coach does something bad, that's probably better to pay attention to that than something good because they all say something good about their players in training camp. And try to weed through it a little bit.
Andy, it feels like this summer was the coronation of TB12 as the GOAT. There might have been some debates before he won the Super Bowl down in Tampa, but now everybody just knows Tom Brady's the GOAT. It's just synonymous. And it doesn't necessarily apply, however, to fantasy football. What are the expectations this season of Tom Brady, fantasy quarterback?
Well, I think he's probably the single best pick at the quarterback position that a fantasy player can make, because you don't have to invest a huge, high draft pick on him. He's an 8th round pick right now in fantasy drafts, whereas you have to spend a 2nd on Mahomes or a 4th on Kyler, or you pay up for Josh Allen. And here's Tom Brady, who's just like, his value's like suppressed because he's 44 years old. So I think he came off the Super Bowl year, and all of a sudden he represents a great value in fantasy drafts, and he ends up on like tons of our teams here in the studio.
Yeah, he had 50 touchdowns, including the playoffs last year. It's kind of crazy. When you look at that top tier for quarterbacks, like Aaron Rodgers in my league, I think went in the 12th round last year. That's not going to happen this year, obviously. But who is a quarterback that you could kind of wait on and still get incredible value other than Tom Brady?
Yeah, I think another name to bring up that's going even later than Brady is Ryan Tannehill. Like, for whatever reason, the stink of Adam Gase has like permeated through multiple years of, Tannehill actually producing for fantasy. And you add Julio Jones to the mix in Tennessee and that play action passing game, and you can steal Tannehill at the back of drafts. Nobody wants him on their team for some reason, but year after year in Tennessee, he's produced.
Andy Holloway joins the show, the Fantasy Footballers podcast. Let's talk some receivers for a second. Some of the high-profile guys I find can be a real risk when you're talking fantasy, because if they get double covered, if they get taken out of the game, they're not going to have those huge stat lines. Who are some secondary receivers you think might emerge, might pop, that you have to be aware of as you're constructing your team?
Yeah, that's definitely a challenge because, when you're looking at the wide receiver position, the best thing you can do is just look at volume. You can't guarantee a guy's going to have a double-digit touchdown season outside of maybe, Devontae Adams is in that mix every year, Tyreek Hill's in that mix. But, you had a player like Adam Thielen last year who didn't have the volume he had in years past, ends up with double-digit touchdowns, but that could come down because that's such an unpredictable and not sticky stat. I'd be looking, when you look at secondary options, I get made fun of on this show all the time for bringing the name up. But, like, A.J. Green is somebody I'm actually paying attention to in fantasy football this year because you're on a prolific offense in Arizona. DeAndre Hopkins, gets double covered, and he's been the target hog there. And here's A.J. Green in this top 5 offense that's just going to be out there. Now, injuries, that's been a problem for him. If you want to avoid him, I get it. But I'm glancing A.J. Green's way as kind of a sneaky, really late-round pickup.
Yeah, Andy, I thought we weren't supposed to ask you about A.J. Green if I was reading Twitter properly.
Him in. That's my agenda. Yeah, I'm working him in.
Andy Holloway joining the show, Ben in for Rich on the Rich Eisen Show. Oftentimes you have to remember that even if a team is really bad, there could be some really good fantasy players on that team. So which team that we are expecting to have a poor season might actually have some good fantasy players on that team?
Oh, man. Yeah, that can be troubling. There's such a difference between the fantasy value and the NFL value on the field. I think you just want to look at teams that are going to give a high amount of volume to a certain player. Like last year, one of the players that was on a huge amount of league-winning teams was actually James Robinson on Jacksonville, a team that won one game. And it was because they handed him the ball so many times over the course of the season. So, while I'm not staring down the Jets right now as a team that's going to offer you a bunch of fantasy value coming out of the gate, but, a team like the Giants, who might not be expected to be at the very tippy top of the division, the NFC East, you still have to factor in Saquon Barkley there, and if they give him the volume that you would hope for, you look at Atlanta. Like Atlanta was at the basement of the NFC South, but the passing volume for Matt Ryan has been so consistent. So do you look at a player like, Russell Gage stepping into the target vacuum that Julio Jones has left, and you might find some value there. So, Carolina is another team that's going to be interesting, changing quarterback and, bringing in some weapons on the offensive side of the ball. So, yeah, you're looking for volume at that point as when you don't have the wins.
And Andy, just reading Twitter, is Brian Edwards really Terrell Owens and Randy Moss? Like, what is going on there? Can I spend a 8th round pick on this guy?
If there was a fantasy league that ran through training camp, I think he'd be on all the championship teams.
I mean, it's incredible.
He gets hype. I mean, he dominated the hype last offseason. So, and what do you have, 15 catches during the regular season? So no, I'm not buying. We have a segment on the podcast where we say, where there's smoke, there's fire. It's all smoke to me in Oakland or in Las Vegas, and so I'm going to wait and see if he can do it during the regular season.
Andy, we're talking about teams that are probably going to be terrible. The Dallas Cowboys come to mind. TJ Jefferson's team. Any star players on that team might have a fantasy breakout season? What do you mean?
I mean, you just need Dak to play football, right? I mean, last year it was an incredible start to that season for him and for the passing offense, and all the weapons are there, and all of that hope gets deleted if Dak's not out there on the field. So. I think CeeDee Lamb has a monster year if Dak is back. I think Zeke bounces back to be an elite top-tier running back, but kind of important that Dak finds his way out onto the field.
Andy Holloway joining the show, the Fantasy Footballers podcast. Appreciate you taking some time this time of year. One last bit of advice for people as they're planning their drafts, they're staying up all night doing mock drafts till the sun comes up. What's one last piece of advice for fantasy football team building?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that first bit of advice would have been to wait on quarterbacks. So that's like a general principle. But, I mean, having a plan is always good. Like, everybody thinks that it's going to go according to those mock drafts and everybody's going to, follow the consensus, but it never works that way. So trying to put yourself into the best position to not tilt on draft day is probably a good idea. And being, I hear a lot of fantasy players that they ask us the question, hey, do I go running back, wide receiver? And we're always saying, stay water. Like, you can't lock yourself into drafting a certain position at a certain spot, or you're not going to, you're going to be tilting from that point forward when your guy's not there. So have a plan, take a deep breath, and, have fun. I mean, and don't draft players that you're not going to enjoy rooting for either. Like, at the end of the day, we're here to have fun. That's what fantasy football is all about.
Andy, hey, this is TJ here. I just had a quick question for you. 3-time fantasy football champion here. I guess I should. This is the proper way to introduce myself.
Big flex.
In the 21-year-old league here, Andy. But normally I've been very good, especially lately, at picking the right rookie running back. It started with Zeke, Kareem Hunt, Jonathan Taylor. I got all those guys their rookie years, and they all did very well for me. Got a few guys in mind, but tell me, what rookie are you looking at that you think that he's going to be the guy this year?
Man, that's such a good question. We've done a lot of deep diving on that topic and paid a lot of attention to, like, the second and third round running backs. When they get on the field, they generally outproduce the incumbents. So the name that comes to mind is Javonte Williams in Denver, because over the last, 5 or 6 years, it's like a 75% hit rate where that guy outperforms the incumbent with Melvin Gordon there. So, some of the big seasons have happened due to injury. I remember Spencer Ware going out in Kansas City. That's what gave Kareem Hunt that big, the big upside that season. But, yeah, I think I'd look Javonte's way, and then I might look Trey Sermon's way late in drafts where that Kyle Shanahan's going to run the football and he's going to succeed doing it. And, Raheem Mostert is there, but Trey Sermon may be waiting in the wings.
Good looking out.
Andy, we appreciate the time. Good luck in all of your drafts, and I know these guys will be checking in with you throughout the season.
Yeah, sounds good, Ben. Thanks for having me on, and good luck in your drafts as well.
Andy Holloway. Let's go. It's
I'm ready.
that time of year, fantasy football, the Fantasy Footballers podcast. Andy, clearly an expert on fantasy football.
Hey, you watched all the way to the end. Thanks for that. Watch more right here.